morning, everyone. Welcome to Empower You. I'm Betty Overstreet. And I just want to tell you, people have been asking me about Dan. Dan will not be here tonight. He had surgery on his knee Friday, and he was hoping to be here tonight, but
we do wish him well. I hope he'll be here on Thursday. Some of you here tonight were in the class on Saturday. We had the documentary, Whose Children Are They? I thought it was a really good documentary. I also thought the discussion afterwards was really good. For some reason, I guess I'm short-sighted because I didn't think that the discussion would last a long time, but it went a whole hour and could have gone longer. So it was really good. I'm sorry that's not on the website so that you can see it. Hopefully we may show it here again. I don't know. Leah Cagle, one of our board members, was in charge of that, and she's open to showing that documentary anywhere she can get a crowd. So if any of you are interested in that, let me know and I will let Leah know. And as I said, that's not posted to the website. All of our classes are posted to the website within 24 hours after the class. So if you miss it or if you want to refer someone to it, you can know the next day you'll be able to go back and watch it. Also want to remind you, we only have 2 more classes. So if you have any ideas for the fall semester, the board will be meeting in July. Just send me a note to betty@empoweryouamerica.org, or you can send it to info@empoweryouohio.org. America, sorry. It'll get to us if you put Ohio in there. If any of you have given me an idea by word of mouth, don't trust me to remember. So please send it to me as well. I just want to remind you, we had a class on with Rick Gibbs on preparing for shortages on April 5th. We had told him we would post to the website where he's going to be giving these classes a little bit more than he was able to do here. All that's posted on our website. Look for his class under April 5th. There was a change to it. So if you looked earlier, go back and look again. I also want to thank those of you that have been so generously giving this semester with your donations. We only can do what we do because you donate to us, because Empower You is powered just on donations. So thank you very much for that. Also want to remind you that the microphones need to be in your hand if you have a question. Our first speaker tonight is going to be taking questions at the end of his presentation. If you have a question, please raise your hand, wait for one of us to bring the microphone to you so that everyone in the room, as well as those online, can hear you. And for those of you online, if you have a question, just drop down to the bottom of your page to the Q&A button and type your question in there, and we will try to get to all of them. And now on for the first part of tonight. Bill Scott is the State Director of Convention of States in Ohio. He is a graduate of Penn State University, where he studied business administration and accounting. He was a corporate auditor, CPA, and financial consultant for the former international accounting firm of Arthur Andersen, become a partner with that firm in Philadelphia. With a specialization in the insurance industry, he later served as chief financial officer for several insurance-related organizations before retiring. After moving to Dayton 4 years ago from out of state, he held several leadership positions with Convention of States, becoming the state director for Ohio last year. Please welcome Bill Scott.
Okay, thank you so much, Betty. Appreciate it. It's really great to be back here at Empower You. I am a big fan of the organization. I've listened more often online, but I've been here in person as well. So you really have a wonderful, wonderful opportunity here to learn, not just from me, you'll learn from me too, hopefully, but from all the things that they present here at Empower You. So with that, Betty gave my background. It is one that is financial oriented. I was a CPA and an auditor and a chief financial officer of an insurance company. So my interests are often financial related, and you'll hear that as we go through tonight in some of the slides that I'm going to present. So we will talk about Convention of States in an overview form, kind of give you an indication of what some of the issues are, why you should be concerned about it. And then we'll talk about where it is and nationally, where we stand with the various states. We'll also talk about where we are in the state of Ohio. We'll also talk a little bit about why doesn't everybody agree with convention states? We'll talk a little bit about some of the opposition. And then we'll wrap it up with some questions and answers, and hopefully you'll have a few for us. So what I'd like to do is start off first with a very short 3-minute video, just to kind of give you an overview, said very well in succinct language that I think everybody will appreciate.
The United States Constitution was written to form a more perfect union that would enable checks and balances to prevent a bloody revolution being a necessary measure to abolish tyranny. Excellent though it was, Colonel George Mason feared the national government might one day. The United States Constitution was written to form a more perfect union that would enable checks and balances to prevent a bloody revolution from being a necessary measure to abolish tyranny. Excellent though it was, Colonel George Mason feared the national government might one day end in a tyrannical aristocracy. The rights of the people needed to be secured against potential corruption at the national level. One of the solutions the framers decided upon can be found in Article 5, which gives state legislators the authority to call a convention that bypasses federal legislators to amend the Constitution. That gives we the people the opportunity to make some long overdue structural adjustments. Maybe term limits would be a good place to start. Here's how the process works. Citizens request their state legislators to pass a bill called an application with operative language identical in each state. These legislators of the states then pass the application. Generally, only a simple majority is needed. Congress shall, by law, call a convention of the states as soon as it receives applications from 2/3 of the state legislatures. That's 34 states. Delegates chosen by the state legislatures attend the convention. Each state only gets one vote at the convention, but they can send as many delegates to represent the state as they so choose. Amendments are proposed, debated, and voted upon at the convention. Finally, ratification takes place in the states. Each amendment must be ratified by 3/4 of the states in order to become part of the U.S. Constitution. But what about a runaway convention? Let's get a reality check. Like constitutional law scholar Robert G. Nadelson says, there are far more political and legal constraints on a runaway convention than on a runaway Congress. The convention delegates, also called commissioners, are bound to the will of their state legislatures. If they don't vote as their states demand, they get recalled. They might even get sent to prison. Furthermore, a full 3/4 of the state legislatures, we're talking 38 state legislatures, must ratify each and every amendment in order for it to become part of the U.S. Constitution. Even Alexander Hamilton and Abraham Lincoln, who favored national government, emphasized that Article 5 gives states authority over the national government. Hamilton writes that national rulers have no option upon the subject. The words of Article 5 are peremptory. The Congress shall call a convention. And Lincoln says the convention mode seems preferable, in that it allows amendments to originate with the people themselves. Article 5 Convention of the States is a safe route to stopping federal overreach.
Okay, hopefully that gives you a little bit of an overview of what the process is all about. We'll talk a little bit more in detail as we go through some more slides. But what is the problem? Here's 3 big ones. We got the debt and spending. That's one of my favorite. Federal overreach. Everybody knows what that means. The government has its hands in just about everything with their one size fits all to all 50 states. And then career politicians. That's where the term limits suggestion comes in. So talking about the first one here, as I mentioned, this is probably what got me involved. 4 years ago, I started with Convention of States, as Betty mentioned in my intro. I've only been in Ohio about 4 years, moved in from out of state to join family that was in the area, grandchildren and so forth. And didn't know anybody in the area except a couple of family members. So I figured this was a really good way to get started. I joined Convention of States and within 2 weeks of moving here, and have never looked back, helped out the organization through a number of different positions. And now I'm in charge of the state, hopefully. And our mission is to get this thing passed in Ohio at some point, and that's hopefully where we'll get to. So our national debt is a real problem. It's something that as a CPA, I can identify with. I worked with a lot of companies that went bankrupt and they needed bankrupt consulting, which my firm and myself provided. So I saw how companies went bankrupt and how they constantly lived beyond their means and didn't budget properly and so forth. Well, the government has that problem too, and I see it in spades. The only difference is they have a printing press, whereas corporation does not have a printing press. They have to actually have the cash and have a way to raise the money. So that's one of my personal bugaboos. So the national debt, who's spending? Where's it coming from? Well, as this chart shows here, it really doesn't matter what party's in charge. It happens under both parties, and the national debt is now, it's showing around 30 trillion. That's with a T, trillion dollars. And just look how it's grown. You can see down there in the Bush Senior, Clinton era, and even Reagan, it was going up, but going at a slower pace. Then under Bush 43 and Obama, both two-term presidents, it doubled under both of them. 100% increase over their 8 years. President Trump, he had one term and it went up about 35, 38%. And now we're looking at 30 trillion. However, I mentioned that my background is finance, and I know a lot of you probably don't follow this kind of thing, but that's not the real number. The real number is about 5 times that. So think about 150, 160 trillion dollars is the real debt of the United States. And that is because the country is on a cash basis. Like if you owned a grocery store or a shoe store, a little small business, you might have your books on a cash basis. Money in, money out, that's it. Corporations put things on their balance sheet, debts and liabilities for things that haven't been incurred yet or where the cash isn't due yet. That's called accrual accounting, and our government doesn't follow that. They follow the cash basis of accounting. So that means that there are many liabilities that have been incurred which are not on the debt balance sheet. So when you put Medicare and Social Security and all these commitments that are made already, you, I, and others have already worked. So you are entitled to your fruits of your labor. Someday you want to be paid for your Social Security, or you want to continue collecting it if you're on it now. The government doesn't recognize that until the checks are sent to you. They don't put a liability out there for what they owe you. So if you're doing government accounting on an accrual basis, it would be 150, 160 trillion dollars. So you can see we got a real problem with our debt. Well, here's where the spending goes. Most of it, as you can see, is mandatory, meaning that there's no choice. The government must spend that money. Social Security and Medicare, as I mentioned, is the vast majority of it. About 5% is interest on the debt. And that number really could be and should be and probably will be higher in the future because the Federal Reserve has kept the interest rates artificially low as a policy. And if they were paying market rates of interest, that debt would be very much higher than 5% of our total. And then you see there's only about a quarter, 28% is actually discretionary. That's the stuff that today you would have the ability to make some decisions and a budget and so forth to try and save money or spend it more wisely if you don't have any way to change the mandatory spending. So another problem is the vast number of regulations that we live under. We all know about laws, we all know about regulations, but regulations are much more plentiful and much more onerous in many respects than laws because these regulations are done by nameless bureaucrats in buildings, concrete buildings in Washington who are not elected and not really accountable. And that's probably 4 or 5 times the amount of paper issued by them than there is by the Congress issuing laws. So Regulations are a big reason why we have a lot of government spending, a lot of bureaucracy, and a lot of problems. One of those documents is our Constitution, which we'll talk about in a little bit here. That is actually 3,000 pages. Many of you probably think the Constitution is a little pocket document, and it was originally, and hopefully maybe someday we'll get back to that, but that's another document that is full of a lot of paper.
People like us, people that are frustrated with Washington, D.C., often say, well, they don't follow the Constitution anyway. Not true. They follow the wrong one. They're following the Constitution as interpreted by the Supreme Court rather than the Constitution as written.
This, taking out of my pocket, is a pocket Constitution. 4,000 words in the original document, 4,400 words. If you count the amendments, we're talking about 7,000 words. But here is the Constitution in force today. This is 3,000 pages of Supreme Court rulings showing what every ruling has done to the original words. This isn't going to get any smaller. In fact, every time they publish this document, they leave a bunch of blank pages at the back for additional rulings that they know are coming. Every page in this document means a grant of power to the federal government. Understand that this is the Constitution in operation today, and unless we change it, unless we make its wording crystal clear, we're going to continue to operate under this document forever and ever until the whole house of cards comes falling down.
People like us.
Okay, so another problem that is no stranger to most people is career politicians. Here's a few. It doesn't matter which side of the aisle they're on. We have career politicians in both parties. And these particular four have ranges of 34 to 47 years in Congress. It's a long time. It's a very long time. But let's look at what the actual tenure of people in Congress is. You just saw that those leaders that everybody knows their name, they're 35 to 47 years, but you'd be surprised to know that the average House tenure is only about 8.9 years, and the average Senate is 11 years. Now it seems awful low. People react, it seems low. That's because the people you hear on the news, the people, the leaders you see are the ones that have been there 30, 40 years and making policy, making news, get interviews and so forth. But in reality, these people do turn over. They get jobs on K Street as lobbyists. They go back to their law firms. They get defeated in elections, all sorts of reasons. But what it really means is when people say, well, we can't afford to have a brain drain. We can't have people leave Congress with all that institutional knowledge. Well, it's already happening. And it's just that the people that are at the top, have the really long tenures. But Congress, no matter, who's in there, they'll be able to continue whether they're in there for 8 years or 6 years or 12 years. So term limits really aren't an issue. The institutional knowledge is there. You don't have to be there 35 years to be an expert on how to write a bill that nobody reads. I'm sorry, but that's just not needed. So anyway, and also the reelection rate, you can see that it's part of the problem. Almost 90% 94.8% are reelected. Big incumbent advantage when they run for reelection. It may be a little different this time. They say that every time, but this time it may be a little different with the mood of the country and whatnot. But that's one of the reasons why people stay so long, is because once they're in, it's pretty easy to stay. So what's the solution? Well, what did the founders say? And what does Article 5 say? And what's Convention of States plan? Have a listen to what the founders said.
The 15th of September, 2 days before they signed the document, the end of 4 long, hot months in Philadelphia, they were ready to go home. But George Mason noticed that Article 5 only had a single method for amending the Constitution. He said, wait a minute, what if Congress becomes an obstacle?
It was given to us by George Mason, who said, look at guys, someday this government's going to abuse its power, and there won't be anything for you ever to ratify if it's counting on Congress to reduce the power of the federal government. So we need to give the states the ability to reduce the power of the federal government.
Okay, so Article 5 founder is Colonel George Mason. Basically, he's the one that stood up in Philadelphia on the 15th of September in 1787 and brought it to everybody's attention that the current draft that we have of this Constitution that we're about to adopt 2 days later didn't provide any way for what happens if we can't trust the federal central government anymore. What's the remedy? Where do we go? Who do we appeal to? And that's when he said we need a way for the people in the states to also make amendments to the Constitution, not just the federal government and the Congress. So he proposed this, and it's also interesting to note that there was no discussion about opposing it. It was unanimous. Madison's notes made a comment in Latin, said non-com. That meant there was no comments about Colonel Mason's proposal. They all agreed it made sense and it was needed. So thankfully, we have that Article 5 in our Constitution, second part. So this is the actual text of Article 5. And the key, whoops, let me go back here. There we go. Key word here is or. This is Article 5. It's very short. The first part of this article talks about how all 27 amendments to date have been done. They've been proposed by the Congress, and then they went out for ratification if they were successful. And this is where George Mason added an or. And these next 13 words, which I think is symbolic of the 13 states, said on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states shall call a convention for proposing amendments. So this is what we're talking about today. In yellow there is how we, the people and the states, can bypass the federal government and the Congress and do common sense amendments through the people and the local governments, basically our state legislatures, who are much more accessible to us as citizens than the folks in Washington, D.C. What you're looking at here is just one page. I know you can't read it, but it's a model resolution of what each of the states that are calling for a convention would present in order to get this Convention 5 or Article 5 passed in their states. And it's short. It's only about 4 pages usually. A bunch of preamble, whereases, and each state can modify the preamble a little bit. But once they get down to the resolved, where I have the check mark there, resolved, where they're saying what the resolution is going to be for, that's where we need some uniformity, where all the states are saying the same thing and what we're proposing. So let me show you a little bit more detail what it looks like. This is that section where it says the legislature of the state, let's say Ohio, hereby applies to Congress under the provisions for calling for a convention of states limited to proposing amendments that impose fiscal restraints, the spending we've been talking about, limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. That's all the agencies and all the deep state that keep putting regulation upon regulation on us. And then finally, term limits of office for both the officials and members of Congress. Now, under this officials, that's just not senators and Congress people. That could be heads of the agencies. It could be Supreme Court justices. It could be anybody who's a federal official. That would be up to the convention to talk about and come up with a proposal, and whatever they propose, if it gets 50% or more support, it becomes a proposal only, just a proposal. So how's it working so far? Well, this is a map of the United States, and it shows you some polls that were done there's about 10 states up there of likely voters, not registered voters, but likely voters, asking them their impression about convention of states. Are you support it? Do you think it's needed? And almost uniformly, the variance isn't that great. You can see that, oops, hitting the wrong button here again. You can see that between 61 and 70-some% support convention of states. So this is a popular item, and it doesn't matter by party. There are more Republicans, just so happens, that are supporting about 75%, but it is bipartisan. More than half of Democrats support convention of states. Usually when we go out and talk to people, and we don't ask their party, of course, or whatnot, but when you say term limits, it doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or Republican, most people agree with that. So you can see why it has bipartisan support with the voters, not necessarily with our legislators yet, but most of the voters. And then other would be the libertarians or people who have no party affiliation or don't declare a party. Now this map is another map showing a little different. It basically shows you where the Convention of States has already passed in 19 states. So the green ones there are the 19 states that have passed this resolution in their state houses. And of the 19, 4 of them were added just this year in 2022, starting in January. Those were Nebraska, Wisconsin, West Virginia, and most recently, South Carolina, I think was number 19. What's interesting about West Virginia, number 18, was that it passed, unlike any other state in the group so far passed. They passed in a single day in both houses of their legislature. The House in the morning, and then within an hour in the afternoon, the Senate passed it as well. And it was also bipartisan. There were some people on both sides of the aisle supporting it in West Virginia. Okay, and now that's the green, that's the past states. The blue states are the ones that have active legislation this year. Now that's where Ohio is right here. You see Ohio's blue. That means that we have active legislation. We have a resolution in both the House and the Senate, HJR 1 in the House and SJR 4 in the Senate, that we hope will get voted on sometime this year in this General Assembly. If it doesn't get voted on or passed out of committee, the General Assembly ends the end of December, and we start all over again next year. Resolution, new sponsors, new everything. But like I say, we'll cross that bridge when we get there. We'll hopefully get it done this year. The yellow states are passed in one chamber. So that means New Mexico, South Dakota, North Carolina, Virginia, for instance, they might have passed in their House or their Senate, but not the other. So you need both houses, of course, to pass in order to have the resolution become effective for that state. So we're more than halfway there at 19, as you can see, especially with those last 4 states that came in this first quarter. So where does it stand in Ohio? Ohio, as I mentioned, we have active legislation in this General Assembly, the 134th General Assembly. They're 2-year sessions, and this one ends in 22. HJR 1 in the House was introduced last year in the fall, in October, by Representatives McLean and Riedel. They are the sponsors of the resolution. We've had 3 hearings so far. 3 hearings were a sponsors hearing where those 2 gentlemen got up and explained to their fellow legislators why they want this legislation, answer questions. And then there was a second hearing where supporters of convention state made their case and told them why it's important to them as individuals or to the country or whatever their reasons were. And then the opponents came in after that in the 3rd hearing and stated their objections why they would not like to see a convention of states. We expect to have another hearing sometime here this year where it'll be what they call interested parties, meaning that both opponents and supporters will be at the same hearing and have an opportunity to dialogue. The Senate is just introduced a little while ago in March by Senator McCauley and Ruley. So we don't have any hearings on that yet in the General Government and Budget Committee, but we hope to have some action on that here in the next couple of months. Big news for us this year was our state officially passed 100,000 petitions signed by people like you in this room, people who want a convention of states and put their name on a petition, by the way, of which after we're finished tonight, maybe after the second presentation, in the back of the room, and there's some folks here with COS t-shirts on, be willing to help you. You can sign the petition here tonight if you like on the paper. You can also go online at conventionofstates.com and sign it there as well. But that's a kind of a big deal to hit 100,000 petitions signed in our state. We, of course, like more support from our legislators to get on the bandwagon. Because as I said, you know, we've got 100,000 people in the state that want this. You saw the polling that I showed you that this is a popular issue all over the country, not just in certain states, not just in red states, not in blue states or what have you. It's across the board. So our volunteers and supporters, they basically go everywhere in order to spread the word and to gain people's knowledge about what this is all about. You'll see them at gun shows, car shows, county fairs, libraries, media appearance. I was on the radio here a couple times in the last 2 months. We will go wherever people will have us, and whether it's maybe it's your card club and you have 20 people, we'll come and talk to you if you would like. Just give us a call. The other thing we're doing, it's not on the slide here, but 2 weeks ago we started a Get Out the Vote campaign in Ohio. What that means is that our convention of state volunteers are manning the phones and they're calling Ohio voters to let them know May 3rd is the primary for Ohio. And for you folks that follow politics very closely, you probably know that we had a real mess this year in Ohio with the redistricting. We still don't have final lines of districts. And because of that, they had to split the primary in two. The only people on the ballot in May 3rd are people running for statewide offices like governor, treasurer, US senator, and so forth. So because of that, and because now there's going to be another primary in August for the regular House representatives and the regular state senators, a lot of voters are confused. And we think there's going to be lower voter turnout because of that. So we're trying to do our part just to encourage people by calling them and asking them to turn out on May 3rd and vote. Don't let it be a low turnout election deciding our candidates. And also, by the way, we're also telling them which candidates support convention of states. We think that's relevant. And we tell them that as well. And there's quite a few actually that are on our list as supporters of convention of states. Some of our supporters that you may recognize, you saw Mark Levin earlier on one of the slides. Mark Levin is a premier endorser of ours. He wrote a book. I have a copy of it here if you haven't seen it. It's called The Liberty Amendments. 2013, he wrote this book to explain to people in great detail what Article 5 is all about and what people should do to try and get amendments to fix the process by going around Congress, having it be done locally in your states, and don't ask a politician in Washington to limit their own power. They'll never do it. So that's why he felt he had to write this book. He's a constitutional attorney. He studied the constitutional for basically his entire professional career, and he's made a lot of good sense in his arguments. So who else is a endorser? We have Dr. James Dobson. Many people know who he is. He's a strong believer in convention of states. Rick Santorum is a fairly new endorser. He joined our organization as a senior advisor. So he's now not only an endorser, but he goes around the country and talks to people about convention of states and testifies in state houses on behalf of the organization. If you want to see what the complete list, that's only a few of them. There's a lot more that you would recognize. Endorsers like Ron DeSantis, Mark Meadows, Dave Rubin, Sean Hannity, Rick Green, Senator Ron Paul, Ben Shapiro, and the list goes on. You can see them right on our website there if you like. All right, let's talk a minute about, I told you why I think, and 60 to 70% of the nation thinks convention of states is a good idea. Some people don't think it's a good idea and they object, and you'll run into them. We run into them pretty regularly, but I say red flags. By red flags, I mean, when you hear some of these words, your antennae should go up if they're complaining about convention of states. Most of these objections are nothing more than FUD. I'd like somebody to tell me what FUD means. Does anybody know what FUD means? Fear, uncertainty, doubt. Hey, give that man a random, absolutely. It stands for fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And that is actually a marketing strategy. It's been around since the 60s and 70s, where corporations have used fear, uncertainty, and doubt to sell against a competitor. Now our opponents are using it to sell against us, saying it's a bad idea. Well, it's just fear. It's not a solution. We have a solution that's right in the Constitution in Article 5. Oops, a little bit too fast there. Okay, the runaway is probably the most common one you'll hear, that basically they'll say, oh, you can't do this. People will gather and all of a sudden you'll lose control and we'll end up having a new constitution. Well, that's just a myth. That's not going to happen. Our legislators and the kinds of people that will be going to these meetings, this convention, are there as agents of their state legislature. They have a set of instructions. They must obey their instructions. And this runaway is basically something that came out of the late 70s. Chief Justice Warren Burger coined the term, and it kind of stuck. He was worried about Article 5 overturning Roe versus Wade, which he was very proud of, that passed under his time. So the other one is CONCON. Now that's a term that means a constitutional convention, but it's kind of said in a pejorative or a slurring way. Oh, we don't want a CONCON. That would be too dangerous, too risky. You're going to rewrite the Constitution. No, it's not a CONCON. There was only one constitutional convention in 1787. What we are proposing is amendments within Article 5 under the Constitution. So there is no authority to have a constitutional convention, and that is a throwaway argument just meant to throw you off track or dismiss you. But it's not a valid concern. Some of the people, groups maybe that you may have heard who oppose convention of states are John Birch Society, Common Cause is another one. And there's a woman by the name of Publius Hulda, that's her pen name. She's a blogger and attorney. And her real name is Joanna Martin. She flies all around the country and shows up at hearings to testify against convention of states. She lives, I believe, in Tennessee, but she'll go anywhere to fight convention of states. And I won't say too much more about her, but if you're interested in her background, it's rather colorful. You might want to put her name in ballotpedia.org and you'll get her bio. Who else opposes? Here's somebody that needs no introduction. Hillary Clinton and George Soros are big opponents of convention of states. And 5 years ago to this, why would they be opposed? Well, you're my straight man here. You're leading me right into the next slide here. But this is a heading. 5 years ago this month, on Good Friday, George Soros's group Common Cause took out full-page ads in multiple papers around the country opposing convention of states, and they listed 230 organizations that also oppose it. Many of them were his Common Cause organizations, or many of them were affiliated with Common Cause. So you can see, right, well, the preamble says that they strongly urge legislatures to oppose efforts to pass a resolution, or if you have passed it, consider rescinding it. So they basically declared war on Convention of States. Now, I said there was 230 in this ad. I'm just going to show you A through F here. It's just not all 230, but you can take a look at some of the organizations that oppose this under the Common Cause and Soros organizations. That's up through F here. Again, a question for the audience. What do you see in common with these names? And I do intend that as a pun. Common cause, common. Other than the common cause, what do these groups have in common that you can think of or see? Anything? Anybody? Okay, most of them are dependent or need to survive on government grants and big government, largesse, and that kind of thing. So they have an interest in not seeing the government shrink. So what can you do to get involved? Well, you can sign the petition. If you're not a petition signer now, in the back of the room, either after, well, I know, Betty, is there going to be a break or not between or not? Okay, there's no break. So then after the next presentation, the end of the night, see the back table there and you can sign the petition paper, or you can do it online. You can become a district captain. That means represent your district and spread the word about Convention of States to others. You can contribute as well. That's not a requirement, but if you feel so inclined, you can do that. So 19 states have passed Convention of States. 19 states have broken the glass and said, yes, it's an emergency. We need a Convention of States to pass. So I think it's time for Ohio to break that glass too. Anybody else agree Ohio should be breaking that glass? Thank you. Thank you so much. I guess I'm right on time, Betty. I have time for a few questions.
We've got time for a couple of questions.
Couple of questions before we go on to the next speaker.
No questions? Here you go.
What if we get our 34 states, but that's not 3/4 of the country? So how?
Yeah, that's correct.
How does that?
You must have been a math major in college, were you?
Yeah.
You're very sharp.
I can add things a little bit.
You're right.
I don't know what happens then. I mean, I
Well,
noticed the whole West
34
Coast looked
states
like
is
they weren't-
2/3. That's what you need. But then to ratify, you need 3/4, which is 38. So that means you need another 4 states, of course, to get on board to ratify. But the thing is, by the time we get up around 32, 34 states, there's a momentum. It's already, you can see it now in this first quarter. There's a momentum growing in the country. We won't stop at 34. And even if we didn't pass another 5, the momentum is there that by the time amendments are proposed, those states that didn't pass it may still be in favor of what comes up. So we don't need to have 38 states in the bag, so to speak, to ratify amendments. We just need to have the momentum there and have good amendments come out of the convention. Well, no, it's not the people. It's not the people, it's the states, remember. So if the ones that didn't vote for it, they're still going to send people to the convention. So even though 34 states may be enough to call it, all 50 states will send delegates, whether they voted for having it or not, because they're going to want to be represented. And as I said, once some common sense amendments come out, and remember, these will be common sense. These won't be radical. They'll be radical to the people who are entrenched in Washington, but they're not radical to the people. They will be popular with the people in states who didn't vote for this. They will see the wisdom of some of these amendments. So I'm confident it'll be another effort from our grassroots organizations to build the case for why these, whatever they come up with, 5, 6, 10 amendments, to get some that will pass. But thanks for that question. Yes, sir.
My name is Nick Knoll. I am the author of this book. It's The War Against Black Americans and Freedom. And this is the war that the Democratic Party has been waging against our freedom since the day this country was founded, and since the Democratic Party was founded. And, you know, this book has a lot to do with the Constitution And there are limits in the Constitution that, of course, are not being followed. And everything you're saying about the obstacles that we face today is true. They're all true. But I strongly believe that if we have a constitutional convention like this, that if we have a convention of states, that we'll end up with a different constitution than we have. And George Soros might be saying he's against that, but George Soros is a liar. And so is Hillary Clinton. I believe that if we have a convention of states, there is a chance of having a runaway. And everything that's going on in this country, all the communications are being controlled by the Democrats. And
Well,
when you say,
I respectfully disagree with you, sir. I mean, that's your opinion, and I appreciate that. But I have respect for the legislatures in Columbus and other state houses that they can run a meeting. That's what they do every single day. Our legislators run meetings. All this thing of convention of states is a meeting to propose amendments, to propose it. They do that every day. They know how to do it. They know why they were sent there. This is not going to run away. That's a myth. It's a total myth.
I'm sorry, we don't have time for any more questions, but as you can see, Convention of States is controversial. Those for it don't understand those against it. Those against it don't understand those for it. And then we have the people in the middle on the teeter-totter that's not sure if they're for it or against it. So I'm going to tell you what Glenn Beck always says. Do your homework so you can be an informed citizen. Thank you, Bill. That was great.
Thank you, Betty.
He mentioned in his talk about poor turnout for the elections. We went to the Board of Elections recently, and they said they expected this election to be just like the last one. And I asked the question, you mean the one we just had last fall when we had a new city council voted in the city of Cincinnati? And they said yes. And I said, didn't they say that was the lowest turnout ever? He said yes. That's not very encouraging, is it? So we need to be encouraging everybody to get out and vote. I just want to take a minute to talk about our last two classes coming up. On Thursday night, we're going to have Tom DeWeese from the American Policy Center talking about the Great Reset. We're starting at 6 o'clock. We're partnering with the Westchester Tea Party. The Westchester Tea Party group is going to provide food. Empower You is going to provide the drinks. So all we need for you to do is to show up. You need to sign up for this class because it is limited to the first 110 in the studio. There's no limit online. And the Great Reset, I know you've all heard about Agenda 2021, 2030, the Green New Deal. It's all the Great Reset, but he's going to also talk about the COVID lockdown and how it is the guideline that will finally impose their ultimate goal. So it's all about control. You need to come and hear what Tom has to say about it. 6 o'clock on Thursday. That's the last class for in the studio. Next Wednesday, no, Wednesday, not a Tuesday or Thursday, May 4th, we will have a Zoom class with Howard Means. He wrote the book 67 Shots, and it's about the Kent State shooting. I think everybody in here, there's a few young people in here that might not know about that. That's history. So you might want to log on and hear all about that. But it was a time in our history that shocked the nation. It's something that nobody could believe happened on a United States campus, but it did. The country at that time was deeply divided, just as it is now. So there may be something to learn about what happened then. So I encourage you to go on and watch that. Get out your tickets. I did not forget the door prizes. So those of you in the studio, would you draw a ticket for me? The last four numbers, 3334. There you go. And you are the winner of the book I just talked about, 67 Shots. So I hope you enjoy reading it. Yeah, I don't need it. That's fine. And for our online winner, who is Linda P., she is winning the new book out, Lies My Government Told Me, about Dr. Robert Malone. Is there anybody in here that doesn't know who Dr. Robert Malone is? Dr. Robert Malone was the one that developed the I can't remember what, but anyway, the COVID vaccine. And he's been very vocal about it was not used the way it was developed to use. I didn't know he'd written a book, so I got to get it because he's a pretty smart guy. And I think it probably took a lot of guts to come out and say whatever he's got in this book, because I've heard him talk several times. So that's it. I think we are ready for our next speaker, Michael Patton. He's a professional engineer who has been working locally 25 years in the aerospace industry. He is interested in alternative energy, film, and history, especially the history of the American Indians in this area and of Cincinnati when it was the frontier. He is a frequent contributor to Street Vibes, the biweekly paper of the Greater Cincinnati Coalition for the Homeless, and which is sold downtown. Seminars that empower you are one of the sources used for those articles. He has learned that much news and even many histories are often so incomplete to be quite misleading. A good question to keep in mind is, what am I not being told? Among his favorite authors are Ayn Rand of Atlas Shrugged, C.S. Lewis, author of The Screwtape Letters and That Hideous Strength, Agatha Christie, her mystery writer and observer of human nature extraordinaire, and G.K. Chesterton, religious writer and author of the Father Brown Mysteries. One of his favorite quotes is by Chesterton, is appropriate whenever your view and actions are outside the norm. A dead thing can go with the stream, but only a living thing can go against it. Please welcome Michael Patton.
Thank you. Where's the clock you were talking about?
Pardon?
Where's the clock you were talking about?
Right at the bottom.
Oh, there. Okay, thanks. Yes. Yes, thank you for that introduction. I am interested in history, and about 10, 15 years ago, I got the writing bug, and I thought I would write an historical novel about Cincinnati. Well, of course, the first thing you have to do is learn a little bit about the early history of Cincinnati. And I quickly realized there were a lot of things that were missing, that the history was incomplete, kind of glossed over. So of course, that just piqued my interest, and I went searching. Oh, wait a minute, let me see. I guess I have to do this. Okay, can you darken the lights a little bit? Hello, can, yeah. Darken. I didn't realize this was going to be difficult. Okay, yeah, okay, thanks. That'll be okay. And there'll be a close-up later. You can't possibly read all of this, I know. But this is a 1787 map showing the newly independent United States. Of course, the outline is pretty inexact. This is Canada to the north, of course, controlled by Britain. And this is Spanish territory, Spanish Louisiana. A lot of this is unexplored. Kind of interest, it doesn't say the United States of America, it just gives some of the individual states. They didn't yet think of us as a country. So I grew up, you know, watching Gunsmoke and Rawhide and shows like that, and a lot of John Wayne movies. And I thought that was the West. Well, when I got started in this, I realized, no, in the late 1700s, Cincinnati was the West. This was the frontier. This is where all the action was. And as I said, I started looking into it. We had incompetent commanders, one very good commander who actually saved the day, a general who was a traitor. You may not have heard of him. And a judge who sold thousands of acres of land with fraudulent titles. You will have heard of him. Sneaky dealings, underhanded dealings by the British, the French, and the Spanish, and the very first congressional inquiry into the executive branch. Oops, what did I do, Betty? Okay, this is an inset of the map, thanks, of the earlier map. Now you can see there's some cities over here along the coast. there's nothing really in the area that would become Ohio, Indiana, Michigan. Sure, there were some settlements, mainly French and Indian settlements, but they're too small to show on the map. It's kind of I find it kind of interesting that we have Indian tribe names, and you can't quite see it, but there's a little dot there. There's a little dot there. That's, I think, is representing the very large settlements, what we might call cities, so they weren't built up the way we think of them. Okay, Revolutionary War ends supposedly in 1783 when the US and Britain signed the Treaty of Paris. Only thing is that most of the Indian tribes had sided with the British and they weren't invited. They did not sign this. They were furious that Britain said, okay, the United States extends from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. And the Indian tribes were saying, wait a minute, we never agreed with this. So the United States attempted to negotiate with the tribes, but there was a problem. There was no central government for the Indians. A lot of the tribal claims overlapped. Sure, we'd find some tribes who'd say, yeah, we'll sell you that land, but did they really own it? Or was the case probably of overlapping claims? So we would go in thinking that we had title, but we didn't, because some other tribes said, no, wait a minute, they don't own the land, we do. On top of all of this, in 1788, so we're still under the Articles of Confederation, Congress promised to sell John Cleve Sims a large tract of land in Southwest Ohio. This is important because he's the one who really encouraged people to come here. And he was selling parcels of land to them. And 3 settlements started: North Bend, Losantiville, soon to be renamed Cincinnati, and Columbia. Well, first problem, he did not actually get the title to the land until 1794. And this is disregarding the Indians. You know, some of whom said, no, you don't own the land, we do. The third problem, and I have no idea why he did this, because he should have known better, he was selling land over by Columbia. That's over by the Lunken Airport area, that settlement there. And Congress never promised him that land, but he was selling title to it anyways. So Congress was telling the people who thought they bought the land from Judge Sims that they had to pay Congress. Well, of course, the settlers were furious at that. And they turned around and sued Judge Sims, and he died broke. Regardless of the claims, there seemed to, and maybe because there was an effort to try to get clear title to the land from the Indians, at least, you know, we were trying, that there wasn't as much turmoil at first as there was in Kentucky. Kentucky had been settled earlier from the settlers from the east, and there was more conflict with the Indians. We had it relatively peaceful here north of the Ohio at first. Now, the British were stirring things up. They didn't just go away after 1783 when they signed the Treaty of Paris. And you might remember from the Declaration of Independence, he has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. That did happen, yes. Sometimes, and this does come up in the history, the Indians captured children of the settlers and raised them as Indians. Often the children identified as Indians. Sometimes when they became adults, they went back to live with the European settlers, with the Americans, but sometimes they just said, no, I'm an Indian, I choose to continue living this way. I should not forget There were some people from Kentucky who were deliberately stirring things up with the Indians. They were trying to provoke a general conflict, and they would come north of the Ohio and raid the Indians. And it was a mess. Ah, crap, I did this again, whatever I did. Okay, and I'll go up. There'll be a detail later. This is a map of 1815. And even though Cincinnati somewhat started to build up, and it has the more or less the current grid pattern. So you can see the site of Fort Washington. It's gone by 1815. The Ohio River, Broadway. I think this is like 3rd Street over here. Some of these dark shapes here, they are remains of Indian mounds that were still there in the Cincinnati area. Oh, and this would later become Liberty, this way up north. Okay, be very careful this time. Okay, this is more of a blow up. You can see this better. So the former location of Fort Washington, yeah. And this shows the area from 2nd Street to basically what is now Central Parkway. But there's nothing up here, you notice. There's no streets. If you've been by Lytle Park, you may have seen this marker. It's off to the west. This is close to where the fort was, which is actually kind of underneath Fort Washington Way. There's another marker on this building to Fort Washington, 1789, 18 to 1808. This monument stands at the site of the fort that served as a major military base for the Northwest Territory. Okay, but what happened there? Why? That doesn't tell you much. And that was the sort of thing I was finding out. Articles of Confederation. Before the Constitution, and we just heard about the Constitution, we were operating under the Articles of Confederation. There was no strong central government, no executive branch, no commander-in-chief, no standing army. At one point, it was down just to 80 men, most of them at West Point. No navy. In fact, the Barbary Coast pirates of North Africa would routinely capture US merchant ships because we were no longer protected by Britain. And they would enslave the crews, make them do slave labor, and also hold them for ransom. And some of them spent years in captivity before they were ransomed. Constitution of the United States. George Washington became the first president and the commander-in-chief. He appointed the head of the army. In this case, he continued with General Harmer, who had been operating under the Articles of Confederation. He directs a fort to be built in Southwest Ohio. Construction begins June 1789. The relations with the Indians in this area began to deteriorate immediately. Of course, you can imagine they're saying, why are you building the fort here? And just as a by the by, in 1794, we finally get going on a Navy, but that's a different story. General Harmer, 1790, he marches north to Kekianga, a large Indian settlement by present-day Fort Wayne, which I think shows up in that map I had earlier. His men were inadequately trained. His leadership wasn't all that good. He kind of divided his forces. He suffered extensive losses in more than one battle. He was pushed all the way back to Fort Washington. At the time, it was the worst defeat by the US Army. General St. Clair is appointed by George Washington. Now, George Washington was a fantastic leader in many ways. One of his shortcomings was he was lousy at picking commanders. And 1791, he marches north. This is General St. Clair. Poor supplies, inadequate training. At one encampment, he divided their encampment. There wasn't enough room for them on one side of the river, so he put them on some of them on the other side of the river. You're in enemy territory. No breastworks made, not even to protect the cannon. So he just had the troops settle in at night in their tents. cannons exposed. Well, the Indians attacked early in the morning and they were able to shoot the people firing the cannons. Eventually, the cannons were silent. Yeah. Now, Fort Recovery, if you don't know, this is north on US 127. You go about, I don't know, maybe 100 miles. I should have looked it up. It's north of Greenville. There's this 100-foot tall monument to the disaster that was there. This is one of the plaques on the monument. Oh, let me go back. Underneath the monument is a crypt where there are bodies of hundreds of the soldiers and civilians. The plaque says over 900 dead and wounded men were left on the battlefield, and 250 women accompanying them were either killed or captured. The women often accompanied their boyfriends and husbands and did laundry, cooked, that sort of thing. Also, sometimes they brought children. This is a little monument to one of the women who's known as Redheaded Nance. She was one of the civilians who followed the troops and who cooked for them. She is known for setting her young child down, she's carrying it there, to beat off an Indian with a frying pan. This is apparently a true story. But when the army fled, she fled, and somehow in the confusion, she left her child behind. She was, of course, totally distraught. I've seen a couple different things. One did say she found the child much years later, that he was raised by the Indians, but I can't verify that. Okay, this is a comparison I did. Don't really have to go through all the details, they'll be online. But if you count all the men that St. Clair had and how many were killed and wounded, and compare that to General Custer, who most people think had the worst disaster, St. Clair comes out worse because Custer had broken his men into 3 battalions, and only one of the battalions was wiped out. That was Custer's last stand. The other 2 were attacked by Indians, but most of the people there survived. So according to Wikipedia, 52% casualty rate for Custer, over 60% for St. Clair. By the way, there's a good little museum over at Fort Recovery. You know, check online, but it's worth seeing sometime, maybe as a day trip, going up there. So of course, that means a congressional investigation. What the heck happened? Well, Congress is supposed to advise and consent. And so obviously they weren't doing their job very well either. So they kind of whitewashed the whole thing, blamed the supplies, and let St. Clair off the hook. And the supplies were a problem. Notoriously, the tents leaked in the rain, which meant that the gunpowder stored in the tents got damp, and it did not really explode like it was supposed to when it was needed. But there was poor training, hardly any training, in fact. You know, the Army was just formed a couple years earlier. So anyways, Washington dumps St. Clair and chooses General Anthony Wayne. Now, here he did well, but you look at his life at that point in time, and you wonder, why did he pick Wayne? Because Wayne was having financial difficulties. He was estranged from his wife. He was on the verge of bankruptcy. And furthermore, he had been elected to Congress and had started to serve. And then someone discovered that there was some vote rigging going on, and he was kicked out of Congress. Yes, that does happen, or did happen. But Washington appointed him anyways. He spent 2 years collecting and checking supplies and training his men before moving north from Cincinnati. He also transformed it. It wasn't called the Army of the United States. It was called the Legion of the United States. And he, as I understand it, he had the infantry, cavalry, and artillery working together as a more integrated unit. Think of today, where we have like the Army and the Air Force, totally separate, totally different commands. You're gonna go all the way up to the top. Wouldn't it make more sense, like we had it in World War II, where you had the Army working, in fact, it was the Army Air Force. And we had this guy here a couple of weeks ago who said the United States hadn't won a major war since World War II. I'm just saying, maybe this is one of the several things we should look at. Anyways, the British had built a fort by what is today Toledo on the Maumee River, just south of Toledo. This is American land. This is after they signed the Treaty of Paris. But you know, they decided, hey, maybe we can encourage the Indians to attack the settlers. Maybe we can help break up the United States. They're still pretty pissed off, you know. This is the backside. These are artist concepts. They had done extensive excavations. So this is based, you saw that's a pretty decent looking fort, actually. And this could easily be supplied from French Canada. I mean, not French, sorry, British Canada. The rapids on the Maumee are just upstream of the fort. I went up there, and I always find it kind of neat that you can find stuff that's like 200 years old. Some of those defensive ditches, they still exist. Okay, they're somewhat filled in, but there were still markings that there was something extensive over there. I don't know how many people have seen this sign on Central Parkway. As far as I can tell, this sign is wrong. We don't have to go into details, but it says Central Parkway follows the route to St. Clair and Wayne. Central Parkway did not exist. There was nothing there. But I showed you the map of 1815. There's nothing there. Anyways, I couldn't resist this. If you go up to Carthage, there is a street that winds alongside the Mill Creek, which is called Anthony Wayne Avenue. Now, given that this area was forest then, and Anthony Wayne, of course, had to cut a path or widen a path that St. Clair had left him, and that's going to be used afterwards. It doesn't just disappear. I think that was probably part of his route north. I haven't found a map from the right time period to verify this, but I bet it was. And I couldn't resist taking the picture with that Indian pointing. No, not that way, this way. Now, further north, out of the town of 7 Mile, I found this road, Old Wayne's Trace Road. Now, that certainly was part of Anthony Wayne's route north. Okay, let's pause a little bit. So the British are arming the Indians. The French guillotine their king, and they send an ambassador to the United States who wants to spread the revolution, the French Revolution. And he wants the United States to join them in war against France and Spain. Washington says, no, France and Spain hasn't done anything to us. So Genet then starts to recruit an army to be led by George Rogers Clark, which would depart from Cincinnati, go down the Ohio and the Mississippi and attack New Orleans. Now, Washington didn't like this idea at all. Now, and as for Spain, they surely heard of this because it was advertised, looking for men to join the expedition. And for some time, General Wayne's second in command who almost got the job of being the chief officer, the senior officer of the army. He was a paid Spanish agent who tried to subvert his campaign by shorting supplies. You know, it takes a long time to get supplies down to Cincinnati because you have to float a lot of them down river from Pittsburgh, and then you have to bring them up trails, horse-drawn, trails that you had just widened or in the wilderness. And Wayne found that his supplies were short. He did inquiries and word came back, Wilkinson's behind this. Now, of course, he had to do his own military intelligence then because we're a brand new army. Later, a tree mysteriously falls on Wayne and almost kills him. There had been a fire on the other side of the tree, weakening it. Wayne was certain Wilkinson was behind this. Anyways, as for George Rogers Clark in Spain, the Secretary of War ordered Wayne to have a fort built, which was called Massac, in what is today Illinois, on the Ohio downstream of Cincinnati to A, intercept the gunboats, the Spanish gunboats, should they attempt to go upstream, or B, to intercept Clark, should he attempt to go downstream. This is a map which kind of shows General Wayne's march north from Fort Washington to Fort Hamilton, which of course is now called Hamilton, Fort St. Clair, which is just west of Eaton, Ohio, Fort Jefferson, there's a little unincorporated area still called Fort Jefferson, Fort Greenville, which of course was Greenville, Fort Recovery, where the monument was, and Wayne had a fort built there and gathered up all the bones and turned them properly. It was said there were so many bones on the ground that they couldn't find a bare spot to pitch the tents. First, they had to gather the bones up in order to pitch their tents. Also, Wayne, certain that Wilkinson is out to kill him, he says Scott, not Wilkinson, would assume command if something happens to Wayne. Oh, yeah, that's not enough. Washington, Congress has to pay for the army that they're raising. They decided to start taxing whiskey. Well, bad idea, you know, especially out west. Started a rebellion. Actually, his tax was so unpopular in Kentucky that they never could collect a dime in Kentucky because they couldn't find any agents who would risk their lives trying to collect the tax in Kentucky. But still, this is a serious matter for a new country. Are we going to survive or not? Okay, summary of events so far. 2 major battles and no victories for the US Army. It has not shown that it could do anything. Britain has a fort on American land, actually has more than one, and is arming the Indians, encouraging them to attack the settlers. The French ambassador commissioned George Rogers Clark to attack New Orleans. Spain sent gunboats to the mouth of the Ohio. American second in command, a paid Spanish agent, is trying to subvert Wayne's campaign. And we have a major rebellion going on. Okay, what were the odds? What odds would you give that we're going to survive the next few years? I don't think any country was taking us seriously at this point. Battle of Fallen Timbers. Again, this is south of Toledo. This is the monument, 1795, near the Maumee River. Wayne had anticipated Wayne was careful. Wayne thought ahead, and that made the difference. He anticipated the attempted Indian ambush from an area where a tornado had blown down the trees. That's why they call it fallen timber. He planned his advance. He kept a reserve to protect his left flank because his right flank was pretty well protected by the Maumee. And as for Wilkinson, Wayne relayed his orders directly to the sub-legion commanders under Wilkinson. He didn't trust Wilkinson to relay his orders, so he basically bypassed Wilkinson. So when the Indians tried to outflank him, he outflanked them instead. The Indians and about 7 Canadians who fought alongside them broke and ran to Fort Miamis. The British had promised them that they could take refuge in the fort if they need to. Well, when the time came, they found the doors bolted shut. And oh man, they were betrayed a second time by the British. The Indian losses in themselves weren't so bad. They were kind of comparable to what Wayne had experienced. Again, Wayne was dealing with relatively new troops, but still, he had gotten the upper hand, and the Indians saw that the United States was not going to be a pushover anymore, and the British could not be trusted. No matter how many promises they made, the British could not be trusted. And this took the fighting out of them, and they agreed that they would sign a treaty. And battle was August 20th, and I just note things started happening in the favor of the United States. The Whisker Rebellion collapsed when Colonel Lee led the Federal Army into Western Pennsylvania. Now, he certainly knew about Wayne's victory at that time. The word got out. The Treaty of Greenville was signed the next year. William Henry Harrison, a future president of the United States, said it was then that the Revolutionary War actually ended, because the Indians that were fighting on the side of the British finally basically signed a treaty ending the war. The Jay Treaty, where Britain again agreed to abandon its forts, was signed in November, but it didn't take effect until a couple years, well, a year and a half later. So again, it was clearly the results of the battle that the word got back to Britain and say, hey, they're getting their act together. We can't just continue doing this. And also, Spain signed the Treaty of San Lorenzo and agreed to open up the Mississippi River to American commerce. So we made it to the world stage. As for the treaty, the Indian leaders who signed the treaty, they did keep their promise of peace. They did not fight again, even during the War of 1812. Not all the Indians. Tecumseh was at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, but he was not a chief. He was not a leader at that time. He did not sign, but the leaders did sign. Ohio became a state in 1803, with much of the state in Indian hands, and a lot of the rest was in federal hands. And this is something which kind of comes up even today. The federal government earned a lot of money from the sale of formerly Indian land to the settlers. Now, this meant that they, of course, you were here last at the first presentation, they never have enough money. So they have to get more Indian land so they can get more money. So they were encouraging the Indians to sell to them. The Treaty of Greenville said that the Indians could not sell the land to anybody other than the federal government. And they were pushing the land, they were pushing the Indians to sell them the land. Jacob Burnett, the guy after whom Burnett Wood is named, he wrote a book. He was an early judge here. And he wrote about this. And he said, when he started, he said he traveled often here, and he could just see over a period of years, fewer and fewer Indians as they sold the land and left. And he was kind of distressed because they said they were very friendly. And the only thing he said in his book about that, he said that the federal government used menaces and bribes, but it doesn't give any details. I could not find any details, but eventually all the Indians did leave Ohio. There are no federally recognized tribes in Ohio anymore. There's was it the Shawnee? I think they bought some private land, and the state of Ohio recognizes them, but there's no federal tribes. So we have no Indian casinos in Ohio either. Okay, Moore and Wilkinson, the traitor. Wayne died the year after the treaty was signed. Some suspect that he was poisoned by Wilkinson. I certainly think so too. It was a suspicious death, very painful death, enormous pains in the bowels and the stomach. And Wayne abandoned the Legion structure. Later, he persuaded President Jefferson to reduce the size of the army, of course. So we were even less prepared for 1812 than we were already. Interestingly, you may have heard about the Burr conspiracy. I'm sure you did, Aaron Burr. What you may not realize is that the chief accuser of Aaron Burr was Wilkinson. Well, we know Wilkinson was working for the Spanish. We know he was a traitor. We know he was a liar. And actually, we know that because after Wilkinson died, historians, and much later, we found records of some of his correspondence with the Spanish in the Spanish archives. There's no doubt the guy was a traitor. Anyways, Wilkinson retired to Mexico and died there. Yeah. One thing I think about, after reviewing all of this is an observation by the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. He was the first chancellor of the United Germany. And there's many, many more examples of this happening, these sort of things happening in our history. He said, Providence watches over children, drunks, and the United States of America. And Michael Medved wrote a book, The American Miracle, where he talks about some of these amazingly fortuitous things that happened, which preserved the United States. Even before, he starts off with the first example he gives is Pilgrims landing in what is now Massachusetts in 1620. Well, they had actually aimed for farther south. They wanted to be near Jamestown. Bad navigation. And they happened to land at a coast where which was empty, and it had a lonely Indian there who was longing for companionship because all of his tribe had been wiped out with disease. And they asked where they could build, and said, well, my old village site is good. No, we're not using it, obviously, and you think of the chances of that, settlers who have no idea how to survive here, and they find a lonely Indian who can help them and who speaks English and who's favorable to Christianity, because actually he had been captured and enslaved. And I believe I can't remember if it was the Franciscans or the Jesuits actually redeemed him. I mean, they bought him and they taught him English. And then he got lonely and he came back, of course, to America. But by that time, his tribe had died. Oh, which reminds me, I may have, in one of my times when I screwed up, I got a minute. St. Clair, Redheaded Nance, articles. Oh, yes, okay. There used to be huge number of Indians here, and especially in the Midwest. We see the mounds. I mentioned the mounds. You look at Fort Ancient, how big that thing is. That was not done by a small tribe. That was not done by just one tribe. That was done by a large-scale organization. We don't have any records of this, but that monument, it was, by the way, it was not a fort. Whatever it was, we know it was not a fort. Shows that must have been a large-scale organization. and that they could do this over a period of time, and the Indian population was much, much larger than it is now. If you go there, there's a very good museum at the fort. I do recommend definitely you go to Fort Ancient sometime and check out the museum. They redid the museum about 20 years ago. Let's see, is that about it? Okay, Spanish whiskey. Yeah, that's it. Oh, then I just have some notes. Okay, where I got the notes. Any questions? Yes. Oh, wait a minute. She needs to get you the microphone.
What areas did the Spanish control besides Florida? What areas did the Spaniards control besides Florida?
Well, the Spanish, let's go back to that map that I had at the beginning. Even though it's out of date, but okay. They had Florida, everything to the west of the Mississippi. Now, this Canada and Louisiana, the area drained by the Missouri River, this had been French, but in the French-Indian War, the France lost virtually all of its possessions, except for a couple small islands, Pierre and Miquelon, over in the Gulf of St. Louis. And so at this time, Spain had everything, and everything to the east of the Mississippi, except for Florida, went to Britain. Things to the west went to Spain, who had been a minor player on behalf on Britain's side during the French and Indian War, sometimes called the 7 Years' War. Now you might be wondering what happened here. How did the Louisiana Purchase happen? Why did we buy it from France? Because Napoleon had actually conquered Spain and he grabbed Louisiana from Spain and then sold it to the United States. Okay.
Any more questions?
It's an awful lot, I know.
Here we go.
I'm aware of a situation where an individual living in Cincinnati about the early 1800s was kidnapped by the Indians around the area of Music Hall, where Music Hall is now today. Well, so my question is this: were the Indians likely to do that type of thing, and for what reason would they do it?
That's a good question. I had mentioned the white Indians earlier. If they just lived the Indian ways, they were called white Indians. If they actually fought on the side of the Indians, they were called renegades. Simon Girty is the most infamous of them, and you may have heard of his name. Another one was William Wells. And it was generally done, the Treaty of Greenville in 1795 said no more of that. And it actually instructed the Indians, and they did. Any of the children they had captured, no matter how old they were now, would have the chance to go back to their families. Some of them did, some of them did not. Why would they do that? In some cases, we know the Indians were making up for losses. They had lost a son, and the side that was responsible for the loss of the son, I guess, would give them a son. I don't know. Is it also for the knowledge? Certainly their skills as an interpreter would be extremely valuable. And also some of them knew special tactics. And William Wells is interesting because in the St. Clair's defeat, he was fighting on the side of the Indians. And his name is on the monument as a renegade. But then he met his brother again. And his brother convinced him to change sides. And he helped Anthony Wayne. And he fought on the side of the Americans. Now, some people never forgave him for his role in the St. Clair's massacre. And it was a prominent role by all accounts. He was one of the Indian leaders. He was so trusted by the Indians. But likewise, he was invaluable as a resource for Wayne because he knew the language, he knew the culture, he knew where they were likely to be. Good question, though. There should be more done. They captured both men and women. I mean, girls and boys. And that was up to maybe about the age of 15 is my understanding. And Jacob Burnett relates a case that he knew of a woman who was captured as a young girl, but refused to go back. She wanted to live the rest of her life as an Indian. So you had a question?
No one else has really written on this area during this time, is that correct?
All I found were bits and pieces. There was Jacob Burnett's book, which I think came out in 1848. A couple of people wrote about St. Clair's defeat in detail, and also Anthony Wayne's victory recently. That's about 10 years ago. Teddy Roosevelt was actually the first one to write about St. Clair's defeat in about 1900. I mean, it was such an extraordinary embarrassment and defeat. No one wanted to talk about it. And even then, you read something like Dick Perry's book, Was You Ever in Cincinnati? That famous classic. He just kind of glosses over the whole thing.
How long did it take you to gather information?
Oh, man. Well, I just did it off and on, for several years. And every now and then I would do a side trip,
Was it hard to get all that?
No, it just took time. And there's more that I want to do. There's definitely more that I want to do. There's an old newspaper called The Spy, which was published in Kentucky. I want to see some of the early issues of The Spy. Before there was a paper in Cincinnati. There's records from the fort. I looked a little bit at them, some photocopies, try to make sense of them. There's early Army archives. Volume 1 is about Cincinnati, but I've not seen that volume. I just read about it,
I just wanted to comment that obviously Cincinnati's being a frontier town during all this time period. These armies are launching from
Yes.
the Cincinnati area. During this time period, what were the biggest cities around, up and down the Ohio River or around, other than Cincinnati? Was that it, or was it Pittsburgh?
No, well, I mean, there was Pittsburgh. Oh, it was Fort Duquesne at that time, something. I forget. Okay, here we go. There was the British Fort of Detroit. There were some settlements in Kentucky. Limestone, which is now called Maysville, was around. Louisville, St. Louis, but these were very small. And there were some French and Indian settlements. They tended to live together. And you read about the exploits of George Rogers Clark during the Revolutionary War. He's famous for actually leading an expedition against some of these combined French-Indian settlements, which were then run by the British, and conquering them. So during the treaty and the negotiations of the Treaty of Paris of 1783, Britain could not claim that they still owned the Midwest because of the defeats inflicted on them by George Rogers Clark. So they kind of said, okay, they're yours. And then they tried to get it back,
We have another question back here.
Do you know if the Judge Sims that's
you mentioned earlier
Yes.
has anything to do with Sims Township?
I'm sure it's the same. And there's also a Sims Road, and I bet Cleves is also named after him, was John Cleves Sims. Yes. And there's a couple places named after St. Clair. I think we should wipe out everything named after St. Clair, and you'll see-
Michael, we have a question online.
Yes.
Someone's asking about the French and Indian War. Did the French fight with or against the Indians?
Normally, the French were fighting on behalf of the Indians. The settlement patterns, and the Indians were fighting with the French. The settlement patterns were different for whatever reason, and this would be a good thing to learn more about, and I don't. And may have to do with religious persecution in England, but a lot more people came over from England, The French, not so much. Some of them did, but they actually had trouble getting people to come to the French colonies. There's a story I read that for New Orleans, when it was French, they would release male prisoners in Paris and then literally chain them to a prostitute and say, okay, you both can go free if you get on this boat to New Orleans. They were that desperate. And I don't know why the difference, but so anyways, the Indians did not feel threatened by the French in the same way. The Indians were normally fighting with the French.
Do we have any more questions?
Well, let me just say, it's not always, because there were some tribes on the side of the British, things were split up. I kind of skipped over it. There was no large-scale Indian organization, confederacy. Most of them were against the United States, but there were some in favor. And they couldn't even really organize amongst themselves for a very long period of time due to internal conflicts.
Thank you, Michael. Let's give him a round of applause. So, wow, good night. 2 different topics, 2 great speakers. Thank you to both of you again. I just want to recognize our board members that are here tonight: Karen Cartier, Barb Horowitz, Ken Bowman, Bill Roll, our treasurer in the back, and of course, Leanne Cartier, our producer back there. And before I let you go, I got to just say one more thing. I'm not a Twitter user, but kudos to Elon Musk.
Yes.
I might become a Twitter user after this. So I hope this is a step up, a very positive thing. So thanks for coming tonight. Have a safe trip home.
All right. Screwed up a couple of times, skipped over a couple of slides because I messed up on that.